The world outside the windows of Flight 447 was nothing more than a peaceful oceanic expanse, a mere blur as the plane glided effortlessly through the sky. The passengers, lost in their own worlds, business people typing away, families chatting softly, and the occasional lone traveler gazing out at the horizon, had no idea that within moments, their lives would be completely shattered. It all began with a sudden, ear-splitting roar, a deep, mechanical groan. The plane shuddered violently, as though gripped by an unseen hand, and then it fell, plunging toward the earth with terrifying speed. Oxygen masks fell from above, but they were useless against the chaos that followed. Passengers screamed, their cries drowned out by the ear-splitting shriek of metal twisting and tearing apart. In the brief moments before impact, every soul on board was confronted with the harsh reality of their situation. They were about to face their worst nightmare. The plane crashed into the dark, merciless waters of the Pacific Ocean. The violent impact tossed the plane's fragments into the churning sea, and yet, against all odds, the survivors emerged from the wreckage. The cold waves seemed to take no mercy, but somehow they managed to cling to pieces of debris and swim to safety. One by one, drenched and broken, the survivors crawled ashore to a strange and unfamiliar island. The island was vast and isolated, with no sign of civilization. It was a land of dense, untamed jungle, jagged cliffs, and narrow beaches. The survivors gathered what little remained of their luggage and possessions, salvaging anything they could from the wreckage. Most were too stunned to fully comprehend what had happened. The shock of the crash still reverberated in their minds as they found shelter under the dense canopy of trees. But even as they tried to calm their nerves and tend to the most basic survival needs, finding fresh water, securing food, and building shelters, an unsettling realization began to dawn. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere. No passing ships, no airplanes overhead, and no signs of rescue on the horizon. The island, which had initially seemed like a refuge, slowly transformed into a prison. It was as if the island itself had become part of the threat. In the early days, they survived on what they could find: fruit from the trees, rainwater they collected in makeshift containers, and whatever scraps of food could be salvaged from the wreckage. But tensions soon began to rise. The survivors were an eclectic group: an ambitious businessman named James, a recently divorced woman named Claire, a retired military officer named David, and a young college student named Sophie, among others. Each brought their own strengths, but also their own fears, insecurities and doubts. Claire, who had once worked as a detective, was the first to realize that something wasn't right. As the days turned into weeks, and their hope for rescue began to dwindle, she noticed a strange pattern among the wreckage. There were items, cargo, crates, equipment that didn't seem to belong on a civilian flight. Even the plane's distress signal had been oddly delayed, which suggested that the crash wasn't an accident at all. One day, Claire ventured further into the dense jungle to explore, and what she discovered deep within the island shook her to the core. She found an abandoned structure hidden beneath the thick foliage, something that resembled a forgotten research facility, long since overtaken by nature. Inside, she found cryptic messages written in a language she couldn't decipher, and files that spoke of high-stakes experiments. Her heart pounded as she realized that the island had a far darker history than anyone could have imagined. The crash was no random accident. It was part of a far-reaching plan. Claire gathered the others and shared her findings, but many were reluctant to believe her. Their primary focus remained on survival, finding food, shelter, and any means of signaling for help. But for Claire, the mystery of the island was something she couldn't ignore. She became obsessed, convinced that if they were to survive, they needed to uncover the truth about their crash. What did the experiments on this island have to do with them? And why had they been brought here? As time wore on, their situation grew more desperate. The island's resources were running thin, and the group found themselves facing increasingly hostile conditions. Storms battered the shore. The sun was relentlessly harsh, and food became scarcer as the jungle's animals seemed to grow more aggressive. Yet the worst challenge came from within. The stress, the isolation, and the uncertainty took a toll on their relationships. Trust began to fray, and the group started to splinter into factions. David, the former military officer, argued that their best chance of survival was to focus on finding a way off the island, even if it meant venturing into the treacherous jungle. James, the businessman, believed they should stay put and wait for rescue, confident that someone would come for them soon. Sophie, the young student, struggled to keep up with the division, caught between the need for survival and her desire to believe in hope. Then, on one fateful night, a storm unlike any they had seen before swept across the island. The winds howled, the sky cracked open with blinding lightning, and the survivors were forced to take shelter in the ruins of the abandoned facility. But in the heart of the storm, Claire received an unexpected visitor, an old man, weathered and wild-eyed, emerging from the jungle. "I've been here for years," he whispered in a hoarse voice. "I saw it all. The crash wasn't an accident. This island, it's a testing ground, a place where they send people to see what they're capable of. You weren't meant to survive. But if you want to escape, you need to face what's buried here." His words hung in the air like a weight, heavy with implications. The survivors now knew that their struggle for survival wasn't just a battle against nature. It was a battle against something much more sinister. The island was part of an experiment, and they had been chosen for a reason. But who had orchestrated it? And what awaited them if they succeeded in surviving? The man's warning was clear. If they wanted to leave, they would have to face the island's darkest secrets. As the survivors prepared for the challenges ahead, they knew one thing. The island was no longer just a place where they had crash-landed. It had become a place where their fates would be decided. Would they escape with their lives? Or would they be consumed by the island's twisted purpose? Each step forward brought them closer to uncovering the truth, but also to facing a nightmare they were not prepared for. The island was waiting, and the survivors had no choice but to confront it head-on if they were to survive the trials that awaited them. But with every day that passed, the mystery deepened. Would they be able to escape? Or was this island truly their final destination? The struggle for survival on the island was only just beginning, and the survivors knew, if they weren't careful, the island itself might be the one to decide who lived and who perished.